Picture this. It's 1921, and somewhere outside Philadelphia, a banker who makes over $1 million a year, which in 1921 money is basically buy a small country money, has just finished building his dream house. Except house is a laughable understatement. This place has 147 rooms. 147. It's 100,000 square feet, which is larger than the White House. It's the third largest private residence in the entire United States. It cost $10 million to build, over $160 million in today's money. And that's not even counting the 400 acres of formal gardens that required 70 full-time gardeners and cost over $1 million a year just to maintain. People called it America's answer to the Palace of Versailles. And in 1980, just 59 years after it was finished, it was deliberately demolished, blown up, reduced to rubble, the largest intentional destruction of a private residence in American history. Not because of fire or natural disaster or war, because nobody wanted it. It was too expensive to maintain, impossible to sell, and America just let it die. Today, all that's left are 4 massive limestone columns standing in a subdivision called Stotesbury Estates, like gravestones marking where an entire way of life used to exist. Tonight, we're talking about Whitemarsh Hall, how it was built, why it was extraordinary, and how it became a monument to the specific kind of extravagant wealth that can't survive when the money runs out and nobody cares enough to save it. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Let's talk about the palace that America refused to rescue. Before we talk about the palace, we need to talk about the man who built it, because Edward Townsend Stotesbury is one of those Gilded Age figures who was spectacularly wealthy, but not particularly famous, which is actually kind of the perfect combination if you want to live in absurd luxury without constant public scrutiny. Edward Stotesbury was born in 1849 into a middle-class Quaker family in Philadelphia. Not poor, not rich, comfortable, respectable, the kind of family where you're expected to work hard and make something of yourself. At 17 years old, in 1866, he got a job as a clerk at Drexel & Company, a banking and investment firm in Philadelphia. Now, being a clerk at a bank in 1866 doesn't sound particularly glamorous. You're basically doing paperwork, running errands, learning the business from the ground up. It's the 19th century equivalent of being an unpaid intern, except you do get paid, just not much. But Edward was apparently really good at it. He understood finance. He understood how money worked, how businesses worked, how to evaluate risk and opportunity. He was meticulous, careful, and smart. The kind of employee who makes partners think, we should probably keep this guy around. By the time he was 33 years old, in 1882, he'd become a full partner in Drexel & Company. And here's where it gets interesting. Drexel & Company was the Philadelphia affiliate of J.P. Morgan & Company in New York, which meant Edward Stotesbury wasn't just a partner in a regional bank. He was effectively part of the J.P. Morgan financial empire, one of the most powerful banking networks in America. His specialty was railroad financing and reorganization. In the late 19th and early 20th century, railroads were everything. They were how you moved goods across the country, how you connected markets, how you built industrial empires. But they were also incredibly expensive to build and maintain, and railroad companies were constantly going bankrupt or needing to be restructured. Enter Edward Stotesbury, who understood how to reorganize failing railroads, how to arrange financing for new lines, and how to make the numbers work. He became one of the go-to guys for railroad money, and he made an absolute fortune doing it. By 1900, his personal income exceeded $1 million annually, which doesn't sound like that much by today's billionaire standards. But remember, this is 1900. There's no income tax yet. That doesn't start until 1913. $1 million in 1900 is worth about $37 million today, per year. By 1910, his fortune was estimated at over $50 million, nearly $1.6 billion in today's terms. He was obscenely, extravagantly wealthy. I literally cannot spend this money fast enough wealthy. But here's the thing about Edward Stotesbury that makes him slightly tragic and also explains a lot about what comes later. He was alone for most of his adult life. He'd married young. His first wife was named Frances Butcher, and they'd had children together. But she died in 1881, when Edward was only 31 years old. And then he just didn't remarry for 29 years. He lived in Philadelphia, working at the bank, making millions, investing in railroads, accumulating this massive fortune. But he lived quietly, almost like a monk. No lavish parties, no social climbing, no desperate attempts to buy his way into high society. He had money, but he didn't have the lifestyle that usually went with Gilded Age wealth, which is kind of wild when you think about it. This is an era when people with way less money than Edward Stotesbury were building massive mansions and throwing elaborate parties and competing to see who could be the most ostentatiously rich. The Vanderbilts were building Biltmore. The Astors were ruling New York society. Everyone was trying to outrich each other, and Edward Stotesbury was just working, making money, living a relatively quiet life despite having one of the largest fortunes in America. It's like if Jeff Bezos decided to live in a studio apartment and never go to parties for 3 decades. But that was all about to change, because in 1910, at age 60, Edward Stotesbury got on a ship to Europe, and he met Eva. Let's talk about Eva, because Eva Roberts Cromwell is the reason Whitemarsh Hall exists, and she's fascinating in her own right. Eva was born in 1865, 16 years younger than Edward, into a family that was respectable, but not particularly wealthy or powerful. She was smart, socially astute, and ambitious in the way that women in the late 19th century had to be ambitious, through marriage and social positioning, rather than careers. Her first husband was Oliver Eaton Cromwell, who came from a prominent family and had money. They married, had children, lived the life of comfortable upper-class Americans. But then Oliver died. Eva was widowed at 44 years old, with children, and a fortune that was respectable, but shrinking. She wasn't poor. She was still wealthy by normal standards, but she was facing the prospect of a comfortable but limited existence for the rest of her life. And Eva was not interested in a comfortable but limited existence. She wanted power. She wanted to be at the center of things. She wanted the kind of wealth and social position that opened every door and made everyone pay attention. The problem was, she didn't have quite enough money to get there on her own. She needed capital. In 1910, Eva was on a ship to Europe, probably doing the grand tour thing that wealthy Americans did, visiting Paris and London and Rome, buying art, seeing culture, being seen in the right places. And on that ship was Edward Stotesbury, 61 years old, widower for 29 years, one of the richest men in America, living like a monk despite having railroad money coming out of his ears. Eva recognized an opportunity when she saw one. I'm not saying it wasn't romantic. By all accounts, Edward genuinely fell for Eva, and she seems to have been fond of him too. But let's be clear-eyed about what this was. A strategic partnership. Edward had money, spectacular amounts of money, but he didn't have a lifestyle to match it. He didn't have social ambition. He didn't have someone to spend it in interesting ways. Eva had ambition. She had social intelligence. She knew how wealth was supposed to work in the Gilded Age. She knew how to throw parties, how to decorate mansions, how to position yourself at the center of high society. She had the blueprint. He had the budget. They married on January 18th, 1912. Edward was 62, Eva was 46, and Eva immediately got to work. The first thing Ava did was renovate their Philadelphia townhouse, not just redecorating, full renovation. She brought in Joseph Duveen, who was basically the premier art dealer and interior designer for insanely wealthy people. Duveen specialized in sourcing European antiques, old master paintings, historical artifacts, the kind of stuff that made American millionaires' homes look like European palaces. Ava and Duveen completely transformed Edward's Philadelphia house. They imported an entire Georgian ballroom from England. Like, they found an 18th century ballroom in an English manor house, disassembled it, shipped it across the Atlantic, and reassembled it in Philadelphia. Because apparently buying furniture wasn't enough. You needed to buy entire rooms from other countries. But even that wasn't enough for Eva. She wanted multiple estates. She wanted a winter place in Palm Beach, a summer place with gardens, and a city residence. She wanted to live like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Whitneys, the families who defined American high society. And Edward, who had spent 29 years living like a frugal Quaker, despite being fabulously wealthy, apparently looked at his new wife's ambitions and thought, you know what? Why not? I've been saving this money for 3 decades. Let's build some palaces. In 1916, Edward and Eva hired Horace Trumbauer to design their new estate outside Philadelphia. Horace Trumbauer was Philadelphia's go-to architect for the obscenely wealthy. He'd already designed mansions for the Widener family, the Elkins family, the Duke family, basically everyone in Philadelphia who had railroad or tobacco or industrial money and wanted to live in a palace. His style was grand, classical, symmetrical. Think columns, think formal proportions, think buildings that looked like they belonged in 18th century England or France rather than 20th century Pennsylvania. When Ava and Edward hired him in 1916, their directive was simple: unlimited budget, build one of America's greatest private residences, not a nice house, not something impressive, one of the greatest private residences in the country. Trumbauer must have felt like he'd won the lottery, an architect's dream client, infinite money and massive ambition. The style Trumbauer chose was Georgian, with Palladian influence, basically 18th century English country house architecture, all symmetry and classical proportions and restrained elegance. The exterior was Indiana limestone, the same material used for the Empire State Building and the Pentagon, known for its durability and its ability to be carved into elaborate detail. The main facade was massive and imposing, but also somehow elegant, long, symmetrical, with a central entrance and wings extending on either side. Columns, pediments, carved details. It looked like something that had been standing for 200 years, even though it was brand new. Let's talk numbers, because the scale of Whitemarsh Hall is honestly absurd. 147 rooms. To put that in perspective, the White House has 132 rooms. Whitemarsh Hall had more rooms than the residence of the President of the United States. 100,000 square feet. That's not including the basement service areas or the grounds. That's just the main floors of the house. Most luxury apartments in Manhattan today are 1,000, 3,000 square feet. This house was 100 times that. 6 stories total, including 3 underground floors dedicated entirely to service spaces, kitchens, storage, staff quarters, mechanical rooms, all the infrastructure needed to run what was essentially a small hotel. Between 28 and 45 bathrooms, depending on which source you trust. Apparently, people lost count. When you have more than 30 bathrooms, what's the point of keeping track? The foundation alone was a massive engineering project. They basically had to build a concrete platform to support this enormous limestone structure. Steel frame construction, meticulous engineering, everything built to last centuries. While Trumbauer was handling the architecture, Joseph Duveen was managing the interiors. And Duveen did not mess around. He sourced antiques from European estates. He found medieval tapestries, Renaissance paintings, 18th century furniture, crystal chandeliers from French palaces. He designed custom features specifically for Whitemarsh Hall. Some highlights: the ballroom, 64 feet long, custom crystal chandeliers, medieval tapestries on the walls, parquet floors that probably cost more than most people's houses. This wasn't a room for family dinners. This was a room for hosting 200 people at a formal ball. The organ, a custom-built pipe organ that was 3 stories tall. Not a piano, not a small organ for religious services. A concert hall quality pipe organ installed in a private house because why not? The bathroom. We've already established there were somewhere between 28 and 45 of them. But get this, the faucets were bronze dolphins, actual sculptured dolphins as faucets, in multiple bathrooms, because regular faucets are for peasants. Underground infrastructure. The lower levels contained industrial-scale kitchens. You need serious kitchen space when you're regularly hosting hundreds of people. A refrigeration plant, because 1920s refrigeration was large and mechanical and required its own room. A movie theatre, because driving to town for entertainment is inconvenient. A gymnasium, for the health-conscious millionaire. And extensive staff quarters. Everything was designed to be self-sufficient. Whitemarsh Hall wasn't just a house. It was a compound that could function independently with minimal need to interact with the outside world. Construction began in 1916 and took 5 years. 5 years of constant work. Hundreds of craftsmen, masons, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, limestone being carved and installed, steel being erected, plumbing and electrical systems being built, floors being laid, walls being painted, fixtures being installed. It was completed in 1921. Total cost: approximately $10 million in 1921 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $160 million in today's money. And that's just construction, not the furnishings, not the art collection, not the grounds. For context, in 1921, you could buy a nice house in a good neighborhood for $5,000, $10,000. The average American worker made about $1,500 per year. Edward Stotesbury spent the equivalent of 6,600 years of average American wages on his house. It's the kind of number that's so large it stops meaning anything. It's just infinite money, translated into limestone and crystal chandeliers. But the house was only part of it, because Eva didn't just want a mansion, she wanted an estate. She wanted grounds that would rival European palaces. The original property was 300 acres, but they expanded it to 400 acres, over half a square mile of land, all dedicated to the estate. For comparison, Central Park in Manhattan is 843 acres. Whitemarsh Hall's grounds were nearly half the size of Central Park, but instead of a public park, it was one family's private garden. The gardens were designed in the French formal style, directly inspired by the gardens at Versailles. Long straight pathways, geometric flower beds, carefully trimmed hedges, fountains and statuary, everything symmetrical, everything precisely calculated. The main vista extended from the mansion's terrace down a long axis, creating a sightline that was carefully engineered to be impressive from the house. The perspective was calculated so that when you stood on the terrace, you saw this perfect composition of garden, fountains, and landscape stretching into the distance. It's the same principle behind Versailles' garden, using landscape as theatre, creating visual drama through geometry and perspective. Here's where it gets truly absurd. Maintaining these gardens required 70 full-time gardeners, 70 people whose entire job was taking care of flowers and hedges and grass. They worked year-round because gardens like this require constant attention: pruning, planting, weeding, mowing, watering, fertilizing. In spring and summer, you're managing thousands of flowering plants. In fall, you're preparing for winter. In winter, you're planning for spring. The estate also had 4 large greenhouses that produced plants, and flowers year-round. Want fresh flowers in every room of your 147-room mansion in January. You need greenhouses growing them in winter. Want elaborate floral arrangements for your parties. Greenhouses. The greenhouses alone probably employed a dozen people full-time. The grounds also included a belvedere, a decorative gazebo or viewing pavilion, positioned to provide views over the gardens, multiple service buildings for storing equipment, housing additional staff, managing the practical needs of a 400-acre estate, a private railroad siding because when you're this rich, you don't drive to the train station. The train comes to your house. The Pennsylvania Railroad built a special siding so that Edward and Eva could board private rail cars directly from their property. Imagine being so wealthy that the railroad company builds custom infrastructure for you personally, operating and maintaining Whitemarsh Hall, just the house and grounds, not including Eva's other estates or their traveling or entertainment expenses, cost over $1 million per year. In 1920s money, that's over $18 million per year in today's terms, just for maintenance, just to keep the place running. Staff salaries, gardeners' wages, heating and electricity, repairs and upkeep, supplies, everything needed to maintain a 100,000 square foot house and 400 acres of formal gardens. Edward Stotesbury's income could cover it. He was making several million a year from his investments and his position at J.P. Morgan, but it was still an absurd amount of money to spend on a house. In 1919, Georges Clemenceau, the former Prime Minister of France, the guy who'd helped negotiate the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, visited Whitemarsh Hall, and he reportedly compared it directly to the Palace of Versailles. Coming from a Frenchman, from someone who'd actually been to Versailles many times, this was high praise, or possibly shade. Honestly, it's hard to tell if he meant it as a compliment or if he was quietly horrified that Americans were building Versailles knockoffs in Pennsylvania, but the nickname stuck, America's answer to the Palace of Versailles, which is either incredibly impressive or deeply embarrassing, depending on your perspective. For 8 glorious years, Whitemarsh Hall was exactly what Eva had envisioned, the center of American high society, a stage for wealth and power and spectacle. Eva threw parties like it was her job, because in many ways, it was her job. In Gilded Age society, hosting was how you demonstrated power and taste, the quality of your parties, the prominence of your guests, the elaborateness of your entertaining. All of this mattered. Whitemarsh Hall hosted formal dinners for dozens of people, balls for hundreds, weekend parties where guests would stay for days. They hosted opera stars. People like Enrico Caruso would perform in the ballroom. They hosted presidents and politicians. They hosted other wealthy families from New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Eva managed everything personally: the guest lists, the menus, the decorations, the entertainment. She had a staff of over 40 people in the house to execute her vision, but she was the one orchestrating it all. The 64-foot ballroom would be filled with guests in evening wear, the crystal chandeliers glittering overhead, the medieval tapestries on the walls, the pipe organ providing music. It was probably the most elaborately decorated room most people had ever been in, and it was just the Stotesbury's party space. Whitemarsh Hall was only one of 3 estates Eva and Edward maintained. They also had El Mirasol in Palm Beach, Florida, their winter residence, right in the heart of Palm Beach society, where all the wealthy families went to escape northern winters. Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, Maine, their summer residence, where they'd escape the heat and socialize with other families who summered in Maine. The Stotesburys operated on a seasonal migration schedule, like wealthy migratory birds. Winter in Palm Beach, spring at Whitemarsh Hall, summer in Bar Harbor, fall at Whitemarsh Hall. Each estate required its own staff, its own maintenance, its own operating budget. The household staff across all 3 properties totaled well over 40 people: servants, cooks, groundskeepers, drivers, secretaries, all the people needed to keep three massive estates running smoothly. Operating all three estates, plus the travelling, the entertaining, the staff, the maintenance, all of it combined cost over $2 million per year. In 1920s money, that's over $36 million per year in today's terms, just to maintain their lifestyle. And for most of the 1920s, this was fine. Edward Stotesbury's fortune continued to grow throughout the decade. By 1927, his wealth was estimated at $100 million, nearly $1.8 billion in today's money. He could afford a $2 million annual operating budget. It was a large percentage of his income, sure, but the principal kept growing. He was making money faster than even Eva could spend it. Everything was fine. Everything was sustainable. Everything was going to continue forever, until it wasn't. October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, the stock market crashed, and Edward Stotesbury, at 79 years old, found himself facing a financial crisis unlike anything he'd navigated before. Edward Stotesbury had lived through financial panics before. The panic of 1893, the panic of 1907, various market downturns and recessions. He was a banker. He understood how markets worked. He'd made his fortune helping railroads survive financial crises. But the 1929 crash was different. The market didn't just decline, it collapsed. Stock values plummeted. Paper fortunes evaporated overnight. Companies went bankrupt. Banks failed. And while Stotesbury's wealth was more diversified than some, he had investments in various industries, real estate, bonds. A significant portion of it was tied up in securities that were suddenly worth a fraction of their previous value. His fortune started shrinking, not slowly, quickly. Here's the brutal reality of owning places like Whitemarsh Hall. The expenses don't change just because your income does. The house still needed to be heated, lit, and maintained. The roof still needed repairs. The grounds still needed 70 gardeners, or realistically some number of gardeners. You could cut back, but you couldn't eliminate them entirely without the gardens turning into wilderness. The staff still needed to be paid. The property taxes still needed to be paid. The maintenance still cost roughly $1 million per year for Whitemarsh Hall alone, not counting the other two estates. When you're making $5 million or $10 million a year, a $1 million maintenance budget is manageable. When your investments are losing value and your income is shrinking, that $1 million starts to feel like a millstone around your neck. Between 1933 and 1938, Edward Stotesbury withdrew $55 million from his accounts at JP Morgan. $55 million in 5 years. He wasn't spending income anymore. He was spending the principal. He was liquidating his fortune to maintain his lifestyle. This is the part where you might reasonably ask, why didn't they just sell Whitemarsh Hall? Move somewhere smaller? Cut expenses? Several reasons, all of them tragic in different ways. First, nobody wanted to buy it. This was the Great Depression. Unemployment was at 25%. People were struggling to afford food and rent. The market for $10 million mansions with $1 million annual maintenance costs was not robust. Who was going to buy Whitemarsh Hall? Another obscenely wealthy family. Most of them were also facing financial problems. The institutional buyers who might have converted it into a school or hospital or museum, they didn't have money either. Even if Edward wanted to sell, he couldn't find a buyer. Second, the art and furnishings were also hard to sell. Eva and Joseph Duveen had filled Whitemarsh Hall with museum-quality art, antiques, tapestries, furniture. In theory, this stuff was worth millions. In practice, during the Depression, the market for luxury art collapsed. Nobody was buying. Auction houses were struggling. If you tried to sell a medieval tapestry in 1933, you'd get a fraction of what you paid for it in 1920. The Stotesbury's wealth was tied up in assets that couldn't be easily liquidated at reasonable prices. Third, Reducing expenses meant admitting defeat. For Edward, and especially for Eva, their lifestyle wasn't just about comfort, it was about identity. Eva had spent decades building their social position. Whitemarsh Hall, the parties, the entertaining, the seasonal migrations, all of this defined who they were in society. Selling Whitemarsh Hall and moving to a regular house would mean admitting that they'd lost, that they couldn't maintain their position, that they were no longer part of the highest tier of society. For Eva, who had worked so hard to build this life, that must have been unthinkable. So they didn't sell, they didn't downsize, they just kept spending, kept maintaining the estates, kept trying to preserve a lifestyle that was becoming impossible to sustain. And here's a final twist that must have been particularly galling for Edward Stotesbury. James Cromwell, Eva's son from her first marriage, Edward's stepson, became a new dealer. He supported FDR, advocated for government intervention in the economy, and promoted policies that involved taxing the wealthy and redistributing resources. For a man like Edward Stotesbury, who'd built his fortune through private banking and railroad capitalism, having his stepson advocate for government control of the economy must have been deeply frustrating. According to some accounts, Edward Stotesbury responded to James's political views by declaring he would leave him nothing in his will. He intended to squander it myself rather than let James inherit money he'd just donate to New Deal causes, which is both funny and sad. Here's a man who'd spent 29 years saving money, then spent the 1920s building palaces, and was now in the 1930s burning through his fortune trying to maintain them, determined to spend every last dollar himself rather than let anyone else decide how to use it. Edward Stotesbury died in 1938 at age 88. By that point, his fortune had shrunk from its peak of $100 million to something much smaller. Estimates vary, but he probably had less than $20 million left, maybe less. He'd spent approximately $80 million maintaining his lifestyle through the Depression. Eva inherited what was left, but it wasn't enough to maintain 3 estates. She had to start making cuts. She closed Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, sold it or let it go, depending on accounts. She reduced staff at the remaining properties. She stopped throwing the massive parties that had defined Whitemarsh Hall's glory days, but she held on to Whitemarsh Hall itself as long as she could. It was her masterpiece, her greatest achievement, the physical embodiment of everything she'd worked to build. Eva died in 1946, and then Whitemarsh Hall's fate was sealed. After Eva died, the estate tried to sell Whitemarsh Hall. Nobody wanted it. They tried to interest schools, hospitals, institutions, any organization that might convert it into something useful. Nobody could afford the maintenance. They tried reducing the price, offering it for less than it would cost to build, for less than the land was worth. Still no buyers. The problem was simple. Whitemarsh Hall was designed for a world that no longer existed. It was built for an era when you could employ 70 gardeners and 40 household staff and spend $1 million a year maintaining a single resident. That era ended in 1929. By the 1940s and 50s, nobody lived like that anymore. Even extremely wealthy people were building smaller houses, more manageable estates. The age of the massive Gilded Age palace was over. For decades, Whitemarsh Hall sat empty. The gardens went wild. Without 70 gardeners, the formal French parterres were overrun with weeds, the hedges grew uncontrollably, and the fountains stopped working. The house itself deteriorated. Roofs leaked, windows broke, vandals broke in and stole fixtures, damaged walls, left graffiti. Water damage, weather exposure, lack of heating, all of it took a toll on the limestone exterior and the elaborate interiors. The pipe organ fell silent. The crystal chandeliers collected dust. The medieval tapestries rotted. It's that particular kind of sadness that comes from watching something magnificent decay because nobody cares enough to save it. In 1980, 59 years after it was completed, Whitemarsh Hall was demolished, not accidentally, not because of fire or natural disaster, deliberately destroyed. A developer bought the property with plans to build a subdivision. The house was too expensive to renovate, too expensive to maintain, and too large to repurpose into anything practical, so they tore it down. Explosives were used for some of it, demolition equipment for the rest. 100,000 square feet of Indiana limestone, crystal chandeliers, medieval tapestries, bronze dolphin faucets, the 64-foot ballroom, the 3-story pipe organ, the 2845 bathrooms, all of it reduced to rubble. It was the largest intentional destruction of a private residence in American history. They salvaged what they could: architectural elements, fixtures, anything that might be sold or reused. Some pieces ended up in other buildings or in private collections, but most of it was just destroyed. Today, all that's left of Whitemarsh Hall are 4 massive limestone columns. They stand in a subdivision called Stotesbury Estates, because of course they named the subdivision after the mansion they tore down to build it. The columns are the only physical reminder that one of America's greatest private residences once stood there. Everything else is gone. The ballroom, the gardens, the greenhouses, the private railroad siding, all vanished. There are photographs, blueprints, and historical records. You can see what it looked like. You can read descriptions of the parties, the lifestyle, the grandeur, but you can't visit it. You can't walk through those rooms or see those gardens. It's just gone. Here's the thing about Whitemarsh Hall that makes it more than just a story about a rich guy who built a big house. It represents a specific moment in American history when wealth was so concentrated and labor was so cheap and social expectations were so specific that building something like this made sense. Edward Stotesbury could employ 70 gardeners because in the 1920s, working-class wages were low and wealthy people employing dozens of servants was normal. You could build a 147-room mansion because construction labor was relatively inexpensive and craftsmen were available who knew how to do elaborate stonework and wood carving. You could maintain this lifestyle because there was no income tax until 1913. And even after it was introduced, the rates were much lower than they'd become later. You could accumulate and keep massive fortunes, but that world was already ending even as Whitemarsh Hall was being built. The 1929 crash accelerated it, but the trend was already there. Wages rising, taxes increasing, social expectations changing. The era of the massive private palace was closing. And when that era ended, places like Whitemarsh Hall became impossible to maintain. Not just financially difficult, actually impossible. There was no one to buy them, no one to staff them, no economic model that supported them, so they were demolished. And what's left is 4 limestone columns in a subdivision, a few photographs in historical archives, and stories like this one. America let Whitemarsh Hall die, not because we were cruel or thoughtless, but because the world that supported it had already died, and we couldn't figure out how to save a palace built for a reality that no longer existed. Here's the thing that makes Whitemarsh Hall's story even more interesting. It wasn't the only massive Gilded Age mansion facing this problem. Dozens of these palaces were built between 1880 and 1920, and by the 1940s, 1980s, they were all facing the same question: survive or die. Some made it, some didn't. Let's talk about why. Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, is probably the most famous survivor. Built by George Vanderbilt between 1889 and 1895, it's even larger than Whitemarsh Hall was. 175,000 square feet, 250 rooms. It's the largest privately owned house in America, and it's still owned by the Vanderbilt family's descendants. So why did Biltmore survive when Whitemarsh didn't? Several reasons. First, location. Biltmore is in the mountains of North Carolina, on 8,000 acres. later reduced to about 125,000 acres, which is still enormous. It wasn't competing with urban sprawl or suburban development. It was isolated enough that the land itself had value as a working estate. Second, they adapted early. In 1930, right after the crash, the Vanderbilt family opened Biltmore to public tours. They started charging admission. They turned it into a tourist attraction while family members still lived there. It was an early form of what we'd now call heritage tourism. Third, they diversified. The estate became a working winery, a hotel, multiple restaurants, event spaces. It's not just a museum, it's a business that generates revenue. Biltmore works because the family figured out how to monetize it before it was too late. They swallowed their pride, opened their doors to tourists, and turned their ancestral home into an attraction. The Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, another Vanderbilt mansion, survived for different reasons. Built in 1895 by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, it's 70 rooms of Italian Renaissance excess right on the Rhode Island coast. It's spectacular. Marble everywhere, gilded ceilings, imported European craftsmanship. The Breakers survived because in 1948, the Vanderbilt family leased it to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year. They kept ownership, but let the Preservation Society manage it as a museum and tourist attraction. In 1972, they sold it to the Preservation Society outright, though family members retained a third-floor apartment where they could stay a certain number of days per year. So the Breakers survived because the family was willing to give it up, not demolish it, but transfer it to an organization that could maintain it as a historic property. Marble House, also in Newport, also a Vanderbilt property, had a similar trajectory, given to the Preservation Society, now operating as a museum. Rosecliff, Newport, built by a silver heiress, was also donated to the Preservation Society and operates as a museum and event venue. Notice a pattern? The Newport mansions survived because they're all clustered together in one tourist-friendly location. There was an organization, the Preservation Society, ready to take them on. The families were willing to donate them rather than watch them decay. Newport became a destination specifically to see these mansions. But for every Biltmore or Breakers, there were dozens of mansions that didn't survive. Linwood Hall in Pennsylvania, built for a streetcar magnate, sits abandoned and decaying right. It's been for sale for years. Nobody wants it. It's too big, too expensive, too impractical. It'll probably be demolished eventually. Idle Hour on Long Island, William Vanderbilt's summer cottage, cottage being a hilarious understatement, was demolished in the 1940s. Too expensive to maintain, no buyer interested. The William Baumgarten Mansion in Manhattan was demolished in 1924, less than 30 years after it was built, because the land was worth more than the house. Dozens of others across New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Rhode Island, demolished, burned, abandoned, subdivided. Looking at all these cases, there's basically a formula for survival. Location matters. Mansions in clusters, like Newport, or in tourist-friendly locations, like Biltmore, had better chances. Mansions in random suburban locations, like Whitemarsh Hall, had nobody fighting to save them. Timing matters. Families who adapted early, who opened to tourists in the 1930s, 40s, had better odds. Families who held on hoping things would return to normal watched their properties decay past the point of salvageability. Institutional support matters. Having a preservation society or museum or university willing to take on the property makes all the difference. Without that, you're hoping some random billionaire wants to buy a 70-room mansion, which, good luck. Adaptability matters. Can the building be converted into something useful? A school, a hotel, a museum, a corporate headquarters? If not, it's probably doomed. Whitemarsh Hall failed on almost all of these. Wrong location, suburban Pennsylvania, not a tourist destination. Wrong timing. Eva held on too long. The Depression made sale impossible. No institutional support. No preservation society stepped in. Hard to adapt. Too big. Too elaborate. Too expensive to convert. It was designed to be one family's private palace. When that was no longer viable, there was no plan B. Here's what's fascinating about this whole pattern. America has a weird relationship with its Gilded Age architecture. We're not like Europe, where 500-year-old castles and palaces are automatically considered national treasures worth preserving at any cost. We're newer, less sentimental about old buildings, more willing to tear things down if they're not useful. But we're also not completely unsentimental. We did save Biltmore, the Breakers, several others. We do have people who fight to preserve historic buildings. The difference seems to be, we'll preserve something if it can pay for itself. Tourism, events, adaptive reuse. Or if someone else, a preservation society, a museum, a university, is willing to take financial responsibility for it. What we won't do, and this is where Whitemarsh Hall died, is preserve something just because it's beautiful or historically significant if there's no economic model to support it and no institution willing to take it on. It's pragmatic in a very American way, but it also means we've lost buildings that were genuinely extraordinary and will never be built again. Let's talk about what actually happened in 1980 when they demolished Whitemarsh Hall, because the process of destroying something this large and elaborate is its own kind of fascinating nightmare. By 1980, Whitemarsh Hall had been empty and decaying for decades. The property had changed hands a few times. A developer, Pennsylvania Building Company, acquired it with plans to build a residential subdivision on the 400 acres. From their perspective, the mansion was a problem, not an asset. It was too damaged to renovate economically. Decades of neglect, water damage, vandalism, exposure to weather. The costs to restore it would have been astronomical, easily tens of millions of dollars, maybe more. It was too large to repurpose. What are you going to do with 147 rooms in suburban Philadelphia? You can't turn it into apartments. Wrong zoning, too expensive to convert. You can't make it a hotel. Wrong location, not a tourist area. You can't make it a school. Too expensive to maintain. Wrong layout. You can't make it a corporate headquarters. Too ornate, too impractical. The land was valuable for residential development, but the mansion was taking up prime acreage and would require expensive maintenance even as a ruin. So the decision was made. Demolish it, salvage what could be sold, use the land for houses. Pragmatic, economically rational, culturally devastating. Before demolition, there was a salvage operation to recover anything valuable or historically significant. Architectural salvage companies came in and removed architectural elements, doors, windows, fireplace mantles, decorative moldings, carved stone detail. These ended up in architectural salvage yards where people building or renovating historic-style homes could buy them. Some of the limestone carvings from the exterior were saved. Decorative elements, capitals from columns, carved panels, pieces that could be incorporated into other buildings or kept as artifacts. Fixtures and fittings, light fixtures, though many of the crystal chandeliers were long gone, stolen by vandals. Plumbing fixtures, hopefully including some of those bronze dolphin faucets, though their fate is unclear. Hardware, doorknobs, hinges, anything metal or decorative that could be removed and reused. Interior woodwork, paneling, built-in bookcases, decorative trim. Quality hardwood doesn't stop being valuable just because the building is being demolished. But here's the sad reality. A lot of it was too damaged to save. Decades of water damage, exposure, vandalism. Wood had rotted, plaster had crumbled, metal had corroded. What would have been priceless if maintained was worthless after years of neglect. And some things simply couldn't be salvaged. The massive pipe organ, too large, too damaged, too expensive to disassemble and move. The elaborate plasterwork on ceilings, you can't remove that without destroying it. The marble floors. Some were salvageable, but many weren't. The bulk of Whitemarsh Hall's interior was simply destroyed because it was too far gone to save. Demolishing a building this size requires serious planning and serious equipment. Some sources mention explosives being used for parts of the demolition, presumably for the steel frame or for bringing down large sections efficiently. Controlled demolition, strategic placement of charges, the kind of thing you see in videos of old buildings coming down in clouds of dust. Heavy equipment, excavators, bulldozers, wrecking balls would have been used for the rest, breaking apart limestone walls, pulling down floors, clearing away debris. It probably took weeks or months to fully demolish a 100,000 square foot building with 6 stories and Indiana limestone walls. The debris, tons and tons of it, would have been hauled away. Some of the limestone might have been crushed and used as fill material. Most of it probably went to landfills. So why did those 4 columns survive when everything else was demolished? Probably because they were far enough from the main house that they didn't interfere with the subdivision plan. They weren't taking up prime lot space. They were distinctive enough that someone, maybe the developer, maybe local preservationists, decided they were worth keeping as a monument, or maybe they were just too expensive to remove. Those columns are massive, solid limestone, probably weighing tons each. Demolishing them would require significant effort and equipment time. Leaving them standing was easier. Either way, they stayed. And now they're the only physical reminder that one of America's greatest houses once stood there. Contemporary accounts of the demolition suggest the local community had mixed feelings. Some people were sad to see it go. Even in ruins, Whitemarsh Hall was impressive. It was a landmark, a piece of local history. People remembered when it was grand, when the Stotesburys lived there, when it represented the height of American wealth and ambition. But others were pragmatic. The ruins were an eyesore. They attracted vandals and trespassers. The property was going unused. Turning it into a residential subdivision would bring new families to the area, increase property values, and generate tax revenue. And honestly, by 1980, Whitemarsh Hall had been a ruin for so long that many local residents probably couldn't remember when it was magnificent. To them, it was just this old, falling apart building that nobody wanted. There were no major organized efforts to save it. No preservation society stepped in to buy it. No wealthy benefactor offered to restore it. No groundswell of public support demanding it be preserved. America just let it go. The subdivision that replaced it, Stotesbury Estates, is a nice suburban neighborhood. The houses are comfortable, well-maintained, probably pleasant places to live, but they're just houses, normal houses, the kind you see in suburbs everywhere, where there used to be a palace. Let's go back to 1938, when Edward Stotesbury died, and talk about what happened to Ava in those final 8 years, because her story is its own kind of tragedy. When Edward died in 1938, Ava inherited what remained of his fortune. By this point, it was probably less than $20 million, maybe as low as $10 and $15 million, depending on estimates, which sounds like a lot. But remember, Eva had been living on $2 million a year. She still owned 3 estates, all requiring maintenance. She still had staff to pay, properties to maintain, a lifestyle to uphold. $20 million sounds like infinite money until you realize you're burning through $2 million annually and have no income generating more. Do the math. At $2 million per year, even $20 million only lasts 10 years. And that's if you don't reduce the principal, which you inevitably do, because investments during the Depression weren't exactly generating great returns. Ava must have immediately understood this was not sustainable. The first estate to go was Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, Maine. This was probably the easiest decision. Bar Harbor was seasonal. They only used it in summer. It was the newest of their 3 estates. They'd acquired it after Whitemarsh Hall and El Mirasol. And the market for Maine summer estates, while depressed, was probably slightly better than the market for massive Pennsylvania mansion. Eva either sold it or let it go. Accounts vary, but by the early 1940s, she was down to 2 estates, Whitemarsh Hall and El Mirasol in Palm Beach. Eva also had to reduce staff, which must have been emotionally difficult, even if it was financially necessary. These weren't just employees. Many of them had worked for the Stotesburys for years, even decades. They'd served at parties, maintained the estates, been part of the household. Now they were being let go because there wasn't enough money to pay them. Some might have been kept on at reduced wages. Some might have been given severance packages if Eva could afford it. Some probably just lost their jobs with little warning. The ripple effect would have been significant in the local community. When the area's largest employer of domestic servants suddenly cuts half their staff, that's dozens of families losing income. But despite the cuts, Eva tried to maintain appearances. She still lived at Whitemarsh Hall part of the year, Palm Beach the rest. She still attended social events, still saw friends, still presented herself as the Eva Stotesbury who had once been at the center of American high society. This is one of those situations where social expectations and financial reality are completely at odds. In Eva's social circle, admitting financial difficulty was essentially admitting failure. You were expected to maintain your position, your lifestyle, your dignity, regardless of what was happening to your bank account. So Eva probably kept up the appearance of wealth, even as she was frantically cutting expenses, selling assets, trying to make the money last as long as possible. She probably still hosted some events at Whitemarsh Hall, though nothing like the elaborate parties of the 1920s. She probably still dressed impeccably, still maintained the social graces, still acted like nothing had changed, while inside, everything had changed. Eva's relationships with her children and stepchildren during this period were probably complicated. James Cromwell, her son, was by this point a committed New Dealer and had ideological differences with the kind of wealth Eva represented. He'd also married and divorced twice, Delphine Dodge, then Doris Duke, so he had his own money and his own life. Louise Cromwell had married Douglas MacArthur, then divorced him in 1929, then remarried. She had her own complicated life. Eva's stepchildren from Edward's first marriage would have been part of the inheritance discussion, which are never simple or pleasant. There may have been arguments about what to do with the estates. James probably advocated for selling everything and distributing the money. Eva probably resisted, wanting to preserve Whitemarsh Hall as long as possible. These kinds of family dynamics, where some members want to preserve the past and others want to be practical about the future, are universally difficult, regardless of how much money is involved. World War II probably made everything harder. Maintaining large estates during wartime was difficult for everyone. Labor shortages, men were in the military, rationing, even wealthy people couldn't always get what they needed. Social pressure, living lavishly while the country was at war looked bad. Eva was probably at Whitemarsh Hall less during these years, maybe spending more time at the Palm Beach estate, maybe traveling less, maybe living more quietly out of both necessity and a sense that conspicuous consumption during wartime was inappropriate. Eva Roberts Cromwell Stotesbury died in 1946 at age 80. She'd lived through the absolute height of Gilded Age excess, through the crash, through the Depression, through a world war. She'd built a social empire in the 1920s and watched it slowly dissolve over 2 decades. Her funeral was probably well attended. She'd been a significant figure in Philadelphia and Palm Beach society for decades. But it wouldn't have been the elaborate affair that might have marked her death in 1929. By 1946, the world had moved on. The Gilded Age was long over. The kind of society Eva had mastered, formal, hierarchical, obsessed with display and status, was fading, replaced by something more democratic, less formal, less interested in elaborate social rituals. After Eva died, Whatever remained of the estate tried to sell or dispose of the properties. El Mirasol in Palm Beach was eventually sold. Palm Beach real estate retained some value even during difficult times, and someone probably bought it, demolished the house, and redeveloped the land. But Whitemarsh Hall, nobody wanted it, and so it sat, empty, decaying, for decades. Eva had held on as long as she could. She'd preserved it through the 1930s and early 1940s, despite the financial impossibility. She'd kept it alive through force of will. But after she died, there was nobody left who cared enough to save it. The palace died with her. So that's the story of Whitemarsh Hall, how it was built, why it was extraordinary, and why it couldn't survive. From Edward Stotesbury's frugal 29 years as a widower to Eva's grand ambitions, from 5 years of construction to 8 years of glory, from the 1929 crash to decades of decline, from 100,000 square feet of Indiana limestone to 4 lonely columns in a subdivision. It's a monument to a very specific kind of American wealth, the kind that could build palaces but couldn't save them when the economy changed, and nobody wanted to pay for the upkeep. Sleep well, wherever you are. And if you ever find yourself with infinite money and someone suggests building a house with 147 rooms and 70 gardeners, maybe consider something a bit more manageable. Good night.